All right, it is October 31st, 2016. This is Engineering Ethics, and we're on lesson 9. So this lesson, we're going to be talking about climate change and geoengineering. So the goal for this week is to set us up for a discussion about geoengineering. I'm going to try to start that discussion today. What I really want to do today is give a sort of history of climate change, history of temperature on the planet. And to give a big sort of understanding, a big picture understanding of how the climate works, how it changes over time. Because geoengineering techniques are techniques designed to operate on geosystems, on climate systems, large-scale climate systems, global engineering projects. And so to appreciate how these projects might work, we need to understand how the climate works first. So I want to start by giving you a sort of big history of climate change on the planet. And then talk a little bit about geoengineering. All right, let me go ahead and just jump into the lesson. So we're on lesson 11. Lesson 9, climate change. Sorry for starting class a few minutes late. So I have a lot of resources here. This is kind of a case study, but there's not some specific case that I want you to study. I sort of want you to talk in general about the challenges of climate change. You can talk about this on a technical level. You can talk about the science of climate change, or the engineering techniques used to mitigate some features of climate change. You can also talk about the political and regulatory environment, the political challenges, the social challenges, ethical challenges that we face in dealing with climate change. But basically this is a sort of normal case study where you find some aspect of the case that interests you, that you can dig into. So our goal is to talk about geoengineering. And geoengineering is sort of the last alternative for dealing with climate change. Before geoengineering, we've known about climate change since at least the 70s, maybe the 60s. So for several decades, we've known about climate change. And for that entire time, our response has mostly been a response for mitigation. So mitigation strategies is our primary response to climate change. Mitigation strategies are strategies for stopping climate change before it gets too bad. Usually, mitigation strategies operate on human social systems. There's things like a carbon tax. Right? So carbon in the atmosphere, carbon emissions leads to global warming. So if we put a tax on carbon and charge businesses money for the carbon they release, then maybe that'll put pressure on them to not release as much carbon. Then maybe we can use that to control the carbon. There have been proposals for what's called cap and trade, where there's some maximum of carbon that you can release, but companies that don't release that maximum can trade the remainder with other companies who release too much carbon. They can sort of sell off the amount of carbon that they trade or that they release. This is another way of sort of clamping down on human activities so that we release less carbon. These are mitigation strategies, changing human behavior so that we lead to less climate change. Mitigation strategies have been proposed since we've known about climate change several decades ago, and they haven't been very effective. We'll look at how effective they've been in class. But mitigation strategies don't seem to be working very well. So the primary alternative to mitigation strategies that gets talked about in the literature are adaptation strategies. So mitigation is about stopping climate change before it gets too bad. And adaptation strategies will accept that climate change is going to happen and there's not really anything we can do about it. And adaptation strategies try to adapt so that we can deal with the changes in climate that are coming. So for instance, evacuating coastal cities, moving all the people who live in coastal cities deep further inland. It's going to be a hugely expensive, time-consuming process, very disruptive process. But you might think that it's better to do it now while we have the luxury to do it sort of at our leisure than to wait until our coastal towns start flooding and then try to evacuate people while things are flooding. It's going to be a lot worse to do it then. Might as well try to start adapting now. This kind of adaptation has already started. Insurance policies on coastal cities in Florida. It's very hard nowadays to insure a home because all the insurance companies know that in 50 years or 100 years, those homes are going to be underwater. So this has already affected housing prices. It's already affected the housing market. And it's going to have bigger economic impacts eventually, right? So the adaptation strategy is to say, okay, well, these effects are coming. How do we adjust how do we prepare ourselves for dealing with these changes, moving everyone inland, this kind of thing. So mitigation strategies fail. Adaptation strategies don't seem to work that well either. They sort of accept that the worst is going to happen. I should probably say that adaptation strategies are most popular amongst sort of libertarians, political conservatives, especially economic conservatives, who don't like government overreach. Right? So they're very skeptical of government power. They don't want to give the government too much power. They like small government. And giving government the power to regulate carbon emissions would be giving them more power to taxes, to raise taxes and so on. And so instead of doing that, libertarians tend to not want to try to fix the problem, but try to just deal with the problem, adaptation. So both of these strategies aren't very promising. They don't seem to be facing up to the difficulties of climate change. So the last alternative is geoengineering. Geoengineering are these large-scale operations on the geosystem itself. So to understand how this might work, let's look a little bit at how the geosystem operates. So most of the information I'm going to be using here, I got from this page on temperature by John Baez. He's one of my friends. He's a physicist, theoretical physicist at UC Riverside. But he's also taken an interest in climate change because climate change really is the most important issue of our time. And so he's wrote this is about a decade old, but this is an overview into the history of temperature. And we're going to look at temperature all the way back to the beginning of the planet. So I have a couple of graphs I want to show you. This is kind of mathy, but bear with me. So we want to look at the history of climate change, and the important thing to know right off the bat is that climate has changed a lot over, temperature has changed a lot over the course of the history of the planet. So the planet Earth is 4.6 billion years old. So this first graph we're going to look at is the entire history of the planet. So 4.6 billion years here at the bottom, and then as we go up the image, we get closer to the present age. And you can see from this image that climate has sort of varied quite wildly over time. Right now, it's even with the present, but it's recently been much colder than normal. And then in the recent past, it's been much, much hotter than it is now. In fact, the planet has seen periods significantly warmer than it is now, but also periods significantly cooler than it is now. It's fluctuated back and forth. And if you look at this graph, there's not an easy pattern here. It's not like a regular cycle where it goes up and down and up and down and up and down in a regular pattern. This is a much more complex beast. It has these sort of wobbly periods that seem strange. This is a chaotic system. This is a very clear case of a chaotic system. There's so many parameters involved with the system that it fluctuates all over the place. So climate changes radically, even over the course of the time that Homo sapiens have been on the planet. Climate has changed, fluctuated pretty rapidly. So climate change is the rule. I should also, even before I get any further, I should make clear that there's a difference between climate and weather. Often we talk about the weather. And what we mean is, what is the temperature, what is the air pressure, and so on. And we usually mean that, what is it today, what is the weather today, what is the weather next week. So weather are short-term climate phenomena. Weather patterns usually happen over the scale of days, maybe weeks, months at the outset. Climate patterns are larger scale weather patterns. Patterns that hold over the time scale of years or decades or thousands of years. So when we're talking about climate is different from the weather because climate refers to larger scale phenomena, patterns that operate over longer time periods. So the climate can be warming even if, next week it's colder than it was on average or whatever, right? Because we're looking at large scale patterns. Okay, so when we're thinking about these large-scale patterns, here's the entire history of the Earth. So 4.6 billion years ago, the Earth was a big ball of rock, a ball of molten rock. So very hot. There's nothing on the planet, it was just a bunch of lava. But then the planet cooled down, and there are a bunch of these weird sort of little jumps from cold back to warm, back to cold. And we know in early Earth's history, it got very cold to the point that it froze over. And this is interesting because one of the checks on climate change is it's called albedo. Albedo. My classroom still here? Yeah, people are still here. Okay. My computer just crashed for a second. Okay. Here we go. Okay. Yeah. Albedo. Okay. So temperature change. So one of the constraints on temperature change is albedo. Albedo is a measure of how reflective a surface is, how easily light is reflected off the surface. And if you know anything about physics of optics or physics of light, that white surfaces are more reflective. They reflect more light than dark surfaces. So snow is white, ice is white, which means that the more ice we have on the surface of the planet, the more light gets reflected back out into space. It means it's harder for the surface to warm up. It's pretty intuitive. The more ice that there is, the colder the planet stays. But this is interesting. And it's sort of confusing because at some point in the planet's past, in the early planet's history, the entire planet froze over. It was a big ball of ice. And if it's all ice, then most of the light is getting radiated away. So we're not exactly sure how that ball of ice eventually melted. But obviously it did. All that ice turned into water, liquid water. And when it did, it led to the Cambrian explosion. So this is the first major turning point on planet Earth, around 600 million years ago, the Cambrian explosion. The Cambrian explosion is where life blooms. There's sort of precursors to life before this, sort of simple organisms, single-celled organisms, and so on. But after the Cambrian explosion, life proliferates and it diversifies radically. The Cambrian explosion is where we find lots of trilobites. Trilobites are sold creature. They don't exist anymore, but they existed in plenty during the early Cambrian explosion. Lots of different species of trilobites, and they're all throughout the fossil record. So the planet was cold, and then it warmed back up again, and then life bloomed. And this first era, from about 600 million years ago to about 225 million years ago, is the origins of life. This is where life first gets going. Notice that the temperature fluctuates a little bit. It gets a little bit cold, especially here in the Carboniferous. But for the most part, the temperature is it's a little bit warmer than it is now, but it's somewhat stable. And this is where all the early life develops. In particular, life starts in the oceans, but eventually moves onto land, and you get plants and insects on land. And the plants on land start growing, and you get things like trees and ferns. One of the things about plant life is that plants have cell walls. So there's a cell and then there's a cell wall around it that keeps the plant rigid, turgid. But those cell walls are also very difficult to digest, difficult to break down. And in fact, when plants first evolved, there were no other creatures on the planet that could digest plant material. What that means is that all the plants would grow, and then they would die, and then they would fall to the forest floor. But they wouldn't decay, and it wouldn't be composted into food for future plants, because none of the creatures that could decompose the cell walls existed at the time. So during early life, you had just this buildup of life, and trees would grow, and then they would die, and they would just fall on this forest floor, and then more trees would grow on top of them. So during this period, especially the Carboniferous period, you have just this massive buildup of living, of biomatter, of biological material. It's this biomatter that gets built up during the Carboniferous that eventually ends up underground because it doesn't get decayed and composted at this time. Instead, it just sort of sits underground, lots of pressure and temperature. That stuff is what eventually turns into the oil that we use today. In other words, the oil that we use today is the result of plant and animal life that grew during this period in the early Earth's history. None of it decayed at that time, so it all just stuck around, and we're pulling it up out of the ground now, sometimes miles underground, but we're pulling it all up and we're burning it all and releasing all that carbon back into the atmosphere. Let me step back and remind you about how plants work. Plant respiration use photosynthesis. It uses sunlight and carbon dioxide to generate energy and to run all of the plant's energy processes. So plants take sunlight and they suck in carbon from the atmosphere in the form of carbon dioxide, and they literally turn that carbon into the material of their bodies. So the plants that you see on the ground are stored sunlight. It's stored sunlight and carbon. It's sequestered carbon, and that carbon was sequestered through photosynthesis, so using sunlight. In other words, it's an incredible amount of energy that's stored in this plant matter. In fact, it's 100 million years of sunlight, several 100 million years of sunlight, all stored up in the oil reserves we have underground. It's sometimes difficult for us to think about respiration, about the sheer mass involved with respiration. So maybe this will help. When you lose weight, if you go on if you try to exercise to lose weight, when you lose weight, most of the weight you lose, you breathe out through your mouth, through your nose, through your lungs. Most of the weight you lose in mass, the weight you lose, most of that mass is in the carbon that you breathe out. You don't lose weight through excretion or urination or anything like that. You're not losing the weight at that end, and you're also not sweating out that weight. You're breathing out that weight. The way that the energy cycle in humans works is that we breathe in oxygen and we breathe out carbon dioxide. And the carbon dioxide that we're producing is all the carbon trapped up in our bodies. So we're doing the exact opposite that the plants are doing. The point here is that biomolecules, carbon-based life forms, are tremendous stores of energy. There's lots of energy trapped up in them. And we're taking hundreds of millions of years worth of stored energy, and we're releasing it back into the atmosphere in the span of 100 years, 200 years. Hundreds of millions of years worth of energy, all released in the atmosphere in the span of a few hundred years. This is the essence of the problem of climate change. We are dumping ridiculous amounts of energy into the atmosphere, and it's going to have a huge impact. So let's keep going to see this impact. So, and please interrupt me whenever you have questions. So the early Earth, especially the Carboniferous, the development of all these life forms, at about 225 million years ago, these big lines are all major life events. The Cambrian explosion, there's a big extinction event. There's a couple of big extinction events, but here's one big extinction event. After this big extinction event, the trilobites die out, and the dinosaurs come to rule the Earth. Notice that during the era of the dinosaurs, temperatures are much hotter than they are now, significantly warmer than they are now. In fact, you need really hot temperatures in order to maintain large animals. All the insects are bigger. There was more oxygen in the environment. Part of the lesson that you should be learning right now is that the kinds of creatures that can live on the planet is intimately related to the composition of the atmosphere and to the temperature on the planet. Changes in temperature, changes in atmosphere composition also change the kinds of creatures you can support. Right, so when it's warmer, you can have dinosaurs around. When it's not so warm, dinosaurs don't work so well. Right, not just temperature, but composition. So all of the oxygen in the atmosphere was put there by living creatures, by plants, and by like bacteria, photosynthetic bacteria. All of the oxygen, right? So before those plants and bacteria were around, and they developed in this period over here, but before they were around, there just wasn't any oxygen in the atmosphere. So the literal composition of the oxygen, right, the gas composition of the atmosphere is the product of life on Earth. And life on Earth and the atmospheric conditions, climate conditions, track each other very closely. So changes in one yield changes in the other. Dinosaurs ruled the Earth for several hundred million years. And then 65 million years ago, there's the KT event, where an asteroid hits the Earth and causes another mass extinction. Dinosaurs all die out, and then afterwards, the mammals rule. So the mammals had evolved before the KT event, but they were not anywhere close to the dominant creatures on the planet. Most of the mammals that lived before the KT event were little small rodents, mice-like creatures. But after the KT event, all the big dinosaurs go away. The dinosaurs that remain turn into birds, and there's lots of room left for mammals to carve out an ecological niche. So 65 million years ago, most of the creatures are pretty rudimentary. About 50 million years ago, you start developing primates. Primates like monkeys and apes and so on. You don't get hominids. Hominids are upright, human-like creatures. Hominids also include the great apes, include chimpanzees and gorillas and orangutans. Hominids developed roughly 20 million years ago. So 20 million years ago was just the last little bit of this part up here. So every single primate, all the monkeys and gorillas and so on, developed within the last 20 million years. So just the very last little tip of this. Hominids developed in the last 20 million years. I'm sorry, primates with monkeys, primates developed in the last 50 million years, so closer to the KT event. But hominids, the great apes, developed in just the last 20 million years. Homo sapiens developed in the last maybe 2 million years. Yeah, Homo sapiens developed within the last like maybe 2 million years ago. We don't have clear evidence. I'm sorry. I'm getting confused. So primates are with all the monkeys, including our distant monkey relatives, including the lemurs and so on. The hominids are the great apes, including gorillas and chimpanzees. The Homo species, which includes things like Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Homo neanderthalis, the Neanderthals, they developed around 3 million years ago, 2 to 3 million years ago. And we start seeing evidence of things like fire, tools, hand axes, and so on, about 1.8 million years ago. You don't get Homo sapiens until about 400,000 years ago, maybe 200,000 years ago. So Homo sapiens as a species are very recent, 200,000 years. Remember, the span of the mammals is 65 million years. So 200,000 years is just a blink of the eye. And 200,000 years, we get Homo sapiens who are genetically modern humans. They have brains our size. They have genetic code that's exactly like ours. Modern Homo sapiens arise about 200,000 years ago, and they look exactly like us. Anatomically, exactly like us. Genetically, exactly like us. Brains our size. Rudimentary tools. But you don't start seeing sophisticated tools, and you don't start seeing things like cave paintings, art, culture, jewelry, domestication of animals like dogs and so on. You don't start seeing these things until humans become what's called behaviorally modern. So there's they distinguish between Homo sapiens becoming anatomically modern and then behaviorally modern. So we were anatomically modern long before we were behaviorally modern. In other words, there were Homo sapiens like us walking around 200,000 years ago, but that didn't have culture and social arrangements that looked very much like modern humans. You start to get that about 80,000 years ago, maybe 50,000 years ago, very recently. So we're just in this last little tiny sliver of this whole story. So I'm going to show a couple more pictures of climate over the ages. And our goal is to get down here to look at climate in human time. But before we get there, let's look at a couple of these pictures. I like these graphs. So this is This is an image of the age of the mammals. This is the last 65 million years. So right here at this border is the KT event. And then as we go this way, we have temperature change. I'm sorry, time, get closer to the present. And on the y-axis here, we have temperature change in degrees Celsius. We can know what happened 65 million years ago. The way they do this is with ice cores. They go into glaciers that we know have been around for millions of years, hundreds of millions of years. And you dig big core samples through the glacier, and the deeper down you dig, the further back in time you go. And then we can analyze those samples for carbon in the atmosphere and other kinds of signs to get a readout of the temperature. And this is an image of the last 65 million years of climate change. Again, climate fluctuates very rapidly. For most of this period, this is all the reign of the mammals. For most of this period, it was a lot hotter than it is now. Again, we're in a period of relative climate cooling, where the temperature is cooling off. It's cooler now than it was 10 million years ago, 20 million years ago. But the pattern is very strange, right? So there's this peak over here, and then it sort of dips down. But it doesn't dip down regularly. So it dips down to here, and then it sort of stabilizes for a while, and then it dips down again, stabilizes for a while, dips down again. And then there's this long period of stability. I mean, where the stability, I mean, there's a fluctuation of maybe a degree Celsius or so. There's some fluctuation, but relative to the peak and the trough in this graph, that period of stability is fairly stable, and that period of stability lasts for 10 million years. We would really like to know what caused a relatively stable climate for 10 million years. And there's some other stable points over here. There's lots of interesting things. The most interesting thing in this graph is this guy over here. Let me blow this up. Open image, new tab. So here in the corner on the border between the Paleocene and the Eocene is called the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum. This is PETM. And what happened is something like 55 million years ago, there was, we don't know why, but for some reason there was a huge spike in temperatures, about 2 degrees Celsius spike in temperature. This is comparable to the spike in temperature we've seen over the last few decades. 2 degrees Celsius, huge change in temperature, and then a huge change right back down. So somehow global temperature spiked and then it went right back down. And the size of the change is about 2 degrees Celsius. It's about the same size of temperature change that we're seeing today. We would really like to know both what caused this change, but more importantly, what caused the reverse, what caused the downfall. Right? If we could figure out how to make a similar 2 degrees Celsius drop in temperature happen for us, that would be amazing. But we don't know how this happened. There's a lot of research going into it. But it's important to recognize that this is on the scales of millions of years. So from one trough to the peak and then back to the trough, that whole time period is about 170,000 years. Right, so hundreds of thousands of years to go from trough to peak to trough. Again, we're seeing a similar scale of change, about 2 degrees Celsius. We're seeing that change happen in a time period of decades, 100 years, maybe 250 years, at most since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So 250 years, the same amount of change that we see here over 170,000 years. Again, this is the problem. It's an incredible amount of energy being dumped into the atmosphere in a very short amount of time. We don't know that we've ever seen this kind of change on this rapid of a scale in history. The PTM might be the closest, but even that's a very slow process compared to what we're doing now. So this is supposed to give you some intuitions about climate change, how this stuff is happening. Okay, but we're today down here at this corner. It gets a little more messy down here because we have a lot more data. And the more recent it is, the more data we have, and so we can fill in a lot of these gaps a little bit better. Let me show you some more of these climate images. So here's the last 6 million years of climate change. And again, you see that there's some peaks and some troughs and sort of fluctuates fairly aggressively. If we go down to just the last million years, so this is just the last million years of temperature change. And what you're seeing here are the ice ages. So when we talk about history, and so when we talk about human history, we talk about these ice ages, and all of these troughs are ice ages, are periods of relative cooling. So remember, hominids have been around for about 2 million years. So this whole period is the evolution of the hominids. Homo sapiens have been around for about 200,000 years. So Homo sapiens, the entire of human history takes place in just this last little bracket. So part of the point is that primates have had to deal with fluctuations in temperature quite dramatically. And even just the last few thousand years, so this is the last 1.3 million years. Remember, Homo sapiens developed around 200,000 years ago, 400,000 years ago maybe, so just this last little bit. And just in humans' time on this Earth, there's been massive fluctuations. We've had to deal with quite a few ice ages. So this is just the last 100,000. This is just the last 100,000 years. So Homo sapiens are already around. In fact, we've been around for at least twice this long. And we're behaviorally modern humans since at least about 80,000 years ago, maybe 60,000 years. So sort of modern human cultures have had to deal with these fluctuating temperatures, where it gets really hot and it gets really cold and then really hot and cold again. We've had to deal with this for our entire time on this planet. These are all the little ice ages that we had to deal with. We've had to deal with this for most of our time on this planet, except for very recently. So the last ice age was called the Younger Dryas, happened about 12,000 years ago. It's a relatively cool, it's relatively warm for an ice age. Here's the Younger Dryas in this image. You see that in the thousands of years before that, there were much colder points. So the Younger Dryas wasn't the coldest point, but recently it was the most coldest period. This is the most recent ice age. Prior to the Younger Dryas, there were still saber-toothed tigers and woolly mammoths and so on around that humans were hunting. Human culture was vibrant, and we were all over the planet by this time. We lived all over the planet by this time, but we lived entirely as hunter-gatherer communities, nomadic communities that would move around. We had to move around because climate was changing so rapidly, right? So when it gets hot, some things get available, but then it cools down, you have to move to other places. And when it gets hot again, you have to move to other places still. Right? So for the vast majority of human existence, we've been nomadic species, sort of moving around, being pushed around by the climate. And that all changed about 12,000 years ago, 15,000 years ago. After the Younger Dryas, temperatures rose, but more importantly, they stabilized. So that for the last 12,000 years, temperature on the planet has been relatively warm, but very stable, fitting very cleanly between these boundaries. It's not fluctuating wildly, but it's stabilizing. It's this stability that is responsible for all of our successes. Every story that you know, every religious tradition and myth, every ritual, every practice, every language, every culture, every people that you know, all grew during these last 12,000 years, during this period of incredible climate stability. This climate stability is what allows us to settle down and form cities as opposed to moving around. This led to us developing agriculture. And the reason we were able to develop agriculture is because uniquely, we were in a position where the climate was conducive towards growing crops in a single place. Before this recent stable period, when temperatures are fluctuating wildly, you can't settle down at all. You can't grow crops in any reliable way because you don't know if it's going to be warm enough for those crops to grow next year. So people just didn't settle down. They moved regularly. They were hunter-gatherers. And the reason we settled down is not because of some technological advance. It was because the climate allowed it. Let me go back to the one other thing that happens after the Eocene optimum, the maximum temperature that was reached during the age of the mammals. After this maximum, things start cooling off. And one of the things you get when things cool off here is grasses. So prior to this Eocene maximum, you didn't really have grasses around. Most of the plants were ferns or trees, sort of big bulky things. But after the Eocene maximum, when things start to cool down, you get, it's possible to start growing grasses. And all of human agriculture depends on grasses, in particular things like wheat, barley, oats, right? These things are crops that we grow that really we can only grow because climate has stabilized, because climate has been warm and stable for the last 12,000 years. I think this is really important. It's really important because this period of climate stability is over. The temperature is already warmer than it's ever been in the entirety of human history. There's more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere than there's ever been with human beings on this planet. We've knocked our position off this little stable point, and things are getting much, much hotter really fast. Obviously, human beings can deal with radical changes in the climate. We've been doing it for our entire existence. It's really only the agricultural age that's the anomaly here. It's only recently that we've forgotten all the techniques for dealing with changing climate. But all the techniques that we have for dealing with agricultural age communities, I mean, that's over. Those techniques aren't going to work anymore. So things need to change. Our social systems need to change, our political systems need to change, because the environment that we're dealing with has also changed. It's changed very radically. Yeah, so I mean, I love this image. It's one of the most terrifying images I know about. I mean, it's terrifying because we like to think that all of our technology and all of our civilization is a result of our big brains, our clever ingenuity, our rational abilities. But if in fact our success is dependent on the climate being stable, and we've knocked ourselves out of that stable position, this doesn't look very good for human beings. In fact, it looks terrible. And this is the consensus of most scientists, is that we're fucked. We don't have the resources for dealing with it. We don't even have the political infrastructure in place for even starting to deal with it. So let's talk about how bad things are right now. September was the warmest on record. In fact, all the last few months have been the warmest of those months on record. Actually, let me show you this. Yeah. Okay. So this is going to be a little animated GIF from. We've been keeping accurate records of temperature since about 1850, accurate in the sense of modern scientific readings. So we have accurate temperature for the last 160 years or so. This graph starts at temperatures in 1850 in the center. That's the baseline. And you can see how over the last 150 years, we've moved very far away from this baseline. So here's the baseline, and you can see sort of jumps. But really, when we get to the 20th century, especially post-World War II, yeah, here we go. And then you can see that it's moving way outside of these bounds, and it's just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And we're expecting this trend to continue. We're expecting us to get above 1.5 degrees Celsius and above 2 degrees Celsius within the next few years. We've already occasionally had days where we were over 2 degrees Celsius from temperature records. And the assumption is that we're going to hit over 2 degrees Celsius within the next few years. Watching this kind of image, it makes me feel like it reminds me of a pot of boiling water. If you put a pot of water on the flame, at first nothing much happens. It takes a lot of heat to heat up that water. So it looks pretty calm at the beginning, but then once it starts gathering heat, it eventually starts changing to the point that it starts bubbling up. So here we're bubbling up now. And the bubbling behavior is sort of radically different from the calm water. But the change happens gradually enough that you don't really sense that change happening. There's the adage of, if you put a frog in a pot of water and then slowly bring it to a boil, the frog won't notice that it's boiling itself alive. It'll just sit there thinking that it's normal, and then until it dies from the boiling. Well, same thing is happening to us. It seems like things are basically the same, not such a huge change, but then all of a sudden this thing is going to be popping and bubbling. And the changes will be much more dramatic, much more severe. So it's important that we're talking about climate change and not just global warming. Global warming is about temperature increasing, and temperature doesn't always increase. It doesn't increase uniformly, and it doesn't increase everywhere. So some places might get colder as a result of climate change. The point isn't so much about getting warmer. The point is really about destabilizing the climate instability, right? Climate instability is where we don't know what's going to happen next year, where we can't predict because the changes are so radical that you can't anticipate what happens next. Yeah, okay. So let's look at some more facts and figures about where we are today. So this is from this climate.nasa.gov. This is NASA's climate change website. And they have a lot of great information on this page about where we are, and especially about these vital signs. How has the sea level risen? Well, sea level is rising about 3.4 millimeters a year. Yeah, and it's much more variable today than it was even just 20 years ago, 30 years ago. Change in sea level, it's rising, and it's rising fairly rapidly. But the really important one is the temperature and the carbon dioxide. So temperature change, on average, we've risen about 0.87 degrees Celsius from the average over our entire record, which goes back to the 1800s. So we've risen about a degree Celsius. One degree Celsius is about, no. An increase in 1 degree Celsius is an increase in 33 degrees Fahrenheit. No. 1 degree Celsius change is 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit change. Yeah, so 0.87 degrees Celsius. It's a little less than 1 degree Fahrenheit change. We've already changed so far. But temperature is closely related to carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere. And carbon dioxide levels are very clearly way out of proportion with where they've been historically. So this is the last 400,000 years of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. 400,000 years is the entirety of human evolution. Homo sapiens have only been around for the last 200,000 years or so. So this is as long as human beings have been around. And the current amount of CO2 in the atmosphere is way more than has ever been the case with human beings on the planet. So the rise in temperature is best explained by this rise in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And the rise of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is exclusively explained by, almost exclusively explained by human activity. These are changes with industrialization. These are human industrial activity releasing greenhouse gases. These greenhouse gases leading to temperature change. I should probably mention that human activity, human greenhouse gases, are not the only things that affect temperature. The most obvious thing that affects temperature is the sun. And we know from the seasons that the temperature changes, the climate changes, as the relationship between the sun and the earth changes. So Earth has a little wobble on its axis, and when the axis is pointed away from the sun, it's colder, and when it's pointed towards the sun, in that hemisphere, it's warmer. Right? These are how the seasons change. Right? So we know that even these very small changes can yield large changes in temperature, and we see these over the course of the season. These aren't the only relevant changes. One really important feature of the way that the Earth's temperature changes, called the Milankovitch cycles. So Earth's axis is slightly tilted, but it's not just tilted and fixed, it's tilted and sort of wobbles, so sometimes it's more and sometimes it's less. And the way that the Earth's axial tilt changes has an impact on how much the temperature change on the surface of the planet. Not just the change in axial tilt, but also the change in eccentricity of the orbit. Right? So sometimes the orbit is closer to the sun, and sometimes the orbit is farther away from the sun, and how that changes over time. Right? These are all things that are captured by what was called the Milankovitch cycles. These are the Milankovitch cycles. Milankovitch cycles are all these repeating patterns of about the relationship between the Earth and the sun. And these cyclical patterns have a big impact on temperature. We know these impacts very well. We've studied the Milankovitch cycles very extensively. So we also know that changes in the Earth's relationship to the sun are not sufficient for explaining the changes in temperature that we're seeing today. In other words, even when you take into account all the variations in the Milankovitch cycles, that's still not enough to explain changes in temperature today. Another thing that affects temperature we already mentioned was albedo, how reflective the surface is. And this also changes over time. The more ice on the surface, the more albedo there is. The higher the albedo, the more reflective it is. And again, we know that changes in albedo, changes in surface ice, aren't sufficient for explaining changes in temperature. The only thing that adequately explains changes in temperature are changes in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And the only thing that explains the changes in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere are human activity. So the data is conclusive. Human beings cause climate change. It's our industrial activity. It's all the greenhouse gases that we're emitting. And again, this makes perfect sense. All those greenhouse gases are the result of stored energy that's been locked up in the planet for millions of years, hundreds of millions of years. And we're releasing all that energy in the span of a few decades. On the Moodle, I show this video. This video is great. This video is one of the largest supercomputer simulations we've ever done. It's a huge supercomputer model of the entire climate system where it's evaluating changes to that system at very high resolution. This can't spot raindrops, but a very high resolution simulation of carbon dioxide. Not just carbon dioxide, but also carbon monoxide in the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide, we breathe out carbon dioxide. Plants breathe in carbon dioxide. But carbon monoxide is a much more severe greenhouse gas. It's much more dangerous greenhouse gas. And it's almost entirely the product of our human industrial activities. I think, carbon monoxide is a result of industry. So what you're seeing is a simulation of how these emissions are produced and what its impact on the overall climate system is. Let me reverse this. So this is 1 year in climate change. So it starts off in January. You see that there's not very much carbon in the atmosphere. There's a little bit of carbon monoxide. But you can also see where all this carbon dioxide is coming from. It's mostly coming from here on the east coast of the United States. That's like, Pennsylvania. That's the Rust Belt and the Steel Belt and so on. It's American industry. There's a little bit here on the California West Coast. There's a little bit here in, what is that, Peru, Chile? Peru? On the west coast of South America. Central Africa. But most of this stuff is coming from North America. It's coming from Northern Europe. and it's coming from China and Japan. And you can see that as soon as these emissions are released into the atmosphere, it just gets taken up by the entire system and spread all over the place. Right? After 5 minutes, you can't tell whether these emissions are the result of China's industrial activity or the United States industrial activity. It doesn't matter where it's coming from on the surface, it's all contributing to the same problem. One of the really awesome things about this video is happening right now. So now it's summer, early summer. That means that all the plants are blooming, that everything's coming green. The more plants there are, the more carbon gets sucked out of the atmosphere, and that's what you're seeing right here. So just a few months ago, it was all red on the top in the northern hemisphere, and now it's almost all clear. The reason it's all clear is because the plants have all bloomed and sucked all that carbon out of the atmosphere. Again, the life on Earth is deeply interdependent with the composition and dynamics of the climate of the atmosphere. So,
Professor, in the video, then he talked about the carbon monoxide.
Yeah.
Right here, instead of that's why there wasn't a presence of the red on the top part, but now he was more like I just watching the video before, he was saying this part, in this case, now you're seeing the monoxide, which is both poisonous to people and something else. I forget what he said, but.
Yeah, it's also a really strong greenhouse gas. So you're right. What you see mostly the last few months here were carbon monoxide, and that's because the carbon dioxide had mostly been pulled out of the atmosphere by the plants. There's still a bunch of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, but it's back to its normal levels, and so that's why the only thing you see here is carbon monoxide. There aren't living systems that breathe carbon monoxide, so that stuff's just staying in the atmosphere. I don't know if I have to actually mention this, but remember the way the greenhouse gases work is that the gases trap light. So gas is up here, here's the surface. Then when light goes through the atmosphere, it bounces on the ground, but then when it bounces up, it hits all the gases, and then it bounces back down. So the energy from the sun ends up staying right there in the atmosphere instead of being radiated off back into space. So the greenhouse gases keep the atmosphere hot. It keeps all that energy trapped in the atmosphere. Yeah. So I'm not sure if there's anything else. Here's okay. Yeah, let me show this. Okay. Actually, let me go back to the video. In this video, you can start to see some of the political problems. So first of all, notice that almost all of the activity is in the northern hemisphere. Very little activity in the southern hemisphere. This is how it works. Almost all of the greenhouse gases get trapped in the northern hemisphere, and not very much because it's the southern hemisphere. Another interesting thing about this, so the equator is right here at the middle. And notice that the equator, it goes through South America, it goes through Central Africa, and it goes through Southeast Asia, Indonesia, the island countries out here. Those countries, they produce some greenhouse gases, but they're not the major sources of greenhouse gases. Most of the sources of greenhouse gases are in the northern hemisphere, but the equatorial region ends up shouldering the brunt of the damage. So most of the environmental consequences happen at the equator, because that's where the sun is hitting most directly. That's where a lot of the energy is being stored, right at the equator. So at the equator, you're going to see the most dramatic changes in temperature. You can see the most dramatic rises in temperature. You'll also see the most dramatic changes in the water system. So you're going to get like droughts and these kinds of things. And part of the challenge here is that these countries that are going to be most affected by climate change at the equator are not the countries that are causing the climate change. It's the northern hemisphere countries that are causing climate change. There's the southern hemisphere countries that are going to have to deal with climate change. And that's a big political challenge. We don't have any methods for international policy for adjudicating between these kinds of disputes between the northern hemisphere and the equatorial regions. Right. resources for dealing with these problems today are all agricultural age technologies. There's things like the city-state, the nation-state. The nation-state is it's an agricultural age technology. We learned during the agricultural revolution, when we were all settled down and domesticating our crops and so on, we learned during that period how to run a city. We know how to run a city pretty well. And our methods for dealing with politics on the planet today are based on that same sort of city-state idea. We have nation-states now. So nations have lots of cities in them, but they're still run by a ruler, looks very much like agricultural age technologies. Notice how little respect the climate system has for our national borders. There's no respect whatsoever. The effects of climate change don't stay within borders, they traverse the entire globe. Right? So the tools we have for working on this assume that one nation can deal with their problems, another nation can deal with their problems, and that's enough infrastructure. In fact, climate change is forcing us to change the tools that we have, to change our approach. Right? We need global politics. We need international relationships and legal standards that apply at the level of the globe. We don't have any of this stuff now. And you can tell how politically weak we are by looking at our attempts to deal with climate change. So earlier, I think this was this year, might have been last year, there was a big Paris conference, 2015. So in 2015, there was this big Paris conference where a bunch of big countries around the world came together to make commitments on climate change to try to come to some resolution about how to deal with climate change. Let me show you what they did. So here's this chart. It's a little interactive chart. Here's where we are now. How much greenhouse gas emissions we're at now? 50 gigatons of greenhouse gas. I'm sorry, 50 billion gigatons. Yeah, giga billion. So 50 gigatons of greenhouse gas emissions every year from the planet. If we stay on the course that we're at, if we change nothing about our behavior, if we continue using fossil fuels at the rate we're using them, and then nothing else changes, we are on path for 6 degrees of warming, 6 degrees Celsius warming. Remember, in the history of humans on the planet, we've never experienced more than about 2 degrees Celsius of warming. These 2 degrees Celsius change is a radical change, completely changes the kinds of creatures that can live on the planet. So 2 degrees is a huge change. Currently, if we don't change anything about what we're doing right now, we're currently on path for 6 degrees centigrade change by the end of the century, by 2100. 6 degrees is catastrophic. At 6 degrees, we won't be able to grow our crops anymore. Like, we won't be able to grow wheat anymore, or corn. If humans can't grow wheat, we're in a lot of trouble. Major crop failures is probably an indication of the end of the species. And we're headed in that direction by the end of the century. This isn't far off future. This is within your lifetime and the lifetime of your children.
Well, any food supply besides wheat you were mentioning before. So.
I'm sorry?
You're just saying wheat's, if we can't grow wheat, but any food supply affected by this temperature change. If that gets affected, then life goes down, basically.
Yeah. Probably not life on the planet. Other creatures will figure out some way of surviving. But all the tricks that we know for surviving require that we can grow crops. And that's the only way we know how to manage our population. So 6 degrees is really, and even before we get to 6 degrees centigrade, we're already going to start seeing problems. So people are estimating that 2030, 2040, we're going to have trouble growing things like grapes for wine, like the regions that we currently grow wine in. Wine is a very delicate crop. It needs to be very specific temperatures. And the regions that we currently grow wine in won't be suitable for wine production anymore. They're going to have to move further north where it's a little bit cooler. And so that's going to be a radical change. Maybe some of the grapes that we use just won't grow anymore, right? Maybe because some of those grapes are specific to certain regions where they grow their wine. So these kinds of things are, and this is going to start affecting us within the next couple of decades, not even until the end of the century, just within the next couple of decades. Some of these specialty crops, maybe coffee, maybe it'll be difficult to grow coffee in the future, in the near future. Right, so these are going to be things that are starting to impact our daily lives in the very near future. And if we do nothing at all, 6 degrees centigrade is basically catastrophic by the end of the century. So we'd like to avoid that. And at the Paris conference, we got all these countries together to make commitments. So by 2030, these countries have agreed to make these commitments. So China has agreed to cut like 20% of its emissions. The US and the EU have much more aggressive policies where they're looking to cut something like 90% of their emissions through 2030. India, Russia, all these countries are making some pledges. And we see that if we keep to, the idea here is if we keep to the pledges, that all these groups made through 2030, we're still looking at around 5 degrees centigrade of change, 5 degrees Celsius. So I should emphasize that these pledges are non-binding. In other words, that there's no penalty for failing to keep this pledge. In other words, these countries could have made any promise they want without penalty. Right? They could have made as radical a promise as they want without penalty. The promises they did make still commit us to 5 degrees centigrade by the end of the century. So this is just if we keep to the pledges they made through 2030, we're still looking at 5 degrees centigrade, and there's no guarantee that we'll keep to these pledges. Again, they're non-binding. There's no penalty for violating them. So it's fully possible by 2030 that none of these countries have met these goals, and that we're even worse off than these predictions. Okay, so through 2050, the agreements have been even more strict. China is more than half. US and the EU are almost 100% cutting emissions. And you can see that from this, we're closer to 4 degrees centigrade. But notice that the others, so these are all the other countries. And notice that although the other countries aren't doing so much to climate change now, as time goes on and as these developed countries are reducing their emissions, then much more of this bulk is taken up by these other countries. These other countries are countries that are not as technologically well developed. They're also not as economically well developed. Maybe even politically, there's challenges for realizing aggressive changes to climate change. So as time goes on, these other countries will be the biggest problem to deal with. But again, even if we keep to these optimistic pledges, we're still looking at something like 4 degrees centigrade of warming. There's nothing on the books that anyone has offered that put us on path to 2 degrees centigrade of warming. It is possible, it's technically possible to keep climate change within 2 degrees centigrade. Within 2 degrees centigrade, maybe things aren't so bad. It gets a little bit warmer, but maybe our crops stay fine. Maybe 2 degrees centigrade isn't bad, but there's no plans in the books, there's no proposals that any of these major countries has, including the United States, that'll actually get us to stay within 2 degrees centigrade. So we're looking at something between 4 and 6 degrees centigrade by the end of this century. Again, this is within your lifetimes and the lifetimes of your children. A large technological breakthrough, some big technological breakthrough that can help sequester carbon from the atmosphere or whatever. Even if we come across something like that in the next 5 years, getting that implemented and then getting all the countries to agree to this kind of policy, right? So even if we have a technical breakthrough, that's not going to help things very much. It's technically possible to fix this if we radically changed our behavior and we coupled that with an aggressive policy that very strict taxes for emissions producing corporations and very strict regulations on emissions and so on. If we as a planet all decided that this was our most important task and we turned all of our resources to work on this problem exclusively, then it would be possible for us to keep below 2 degrees centigrade. It's technologically possible. But we do not have the motivation to do this at all. No one is willing to put in that kind of effort. So we're basically condemning ourselves to 6 degrees centigrade or worse.
What's your opinion on it? Do you think we should have such a serious, like it should be our number one priority?
Yeah, absolutely. It's without a doubt, it is the most important problem facing humanity in both the short and the long term. We're already starting to see effects of it now. All the hurricanes that we've been getting. I talked about moving people from coastal cities earlier, and the insurance problem in the housing market. That's a result of climate change.
But okay.
I mean, these are the small problems, and they're just going to get bigger and bigger as time goes on. So all of the hurricanes we've been getting, a record number of Category 5 hurricanes. So a hurricane is a way of dispersing energy. The structure of the hurricane is the most efficient way of getting rid of all that energy. So you get lots of hurricanes when there's a lot of energy in the environment, in the atmosphere, and we have a ton of energy in the atmosphere. We've been putting a bunch of energy in the atmosphere. So we're getting these huge hurricanes which have tremendous damage, and we're getting them more frequently. These sort of once in a decade hurricanes, we're getting them several times a year, and that's going to be happening more often. So the damages from that, the damages to crop failures, severe droughts, these things are already happening, and they're already having serious economic and political consequences. People talk about the wars in Syria. The very gruesome war in Syria is partly a result of lots of farmers who had their crops fail because of massive droughts, and these droughts are a product of climate change. Right? So we're seeing radical political instability, radical economic instability as a result of this climate change. And as these things get more severe, it'll become more obvious that this is what deserves all of our focus. Now, I want to say one other thing. We have had in our past periods of time where, in fact, the world did come together and devote all of its resources for one purpose. The most recent time we've done this was World War II. World War II, everyone sacrificed almost everything they had for the war effort, right? They put all of their resources into the war effort. And it wasn't just individuals, it was nations, it was most of the nations in the world, where for a significant chunk of the 20th century, we were investing all of our resources into the war machine. It's because we were so dedicated to the war that even today, the war is still what drives the U.S. economy. It's still what drives international relations. But we do have these examples where people realized there was a problem and everyone got together and contributed resources to dealing with the problem, where we made it our global priority. Right? That's why it was a world war. It was our global priority. And we need to be thinking about climate change as something that requires even more investment of resources. It's an even more dire problem. No one's thinking about climate change as a war, but it's literally threatening our existence as a species. It's threatening our continued place on this planet, and it's threatening it in our lifetimes. I should mention that the oil industry knew about climate change. They knew it was a problem, and they knew the kind of environmental impact that it would have. And they knew about this back in the 70s. And because they knew about it, they, instead of trying to fix it or anticipating and get ahead of the problem, what they did was they repressed research. They prevented research from being done on climate change, right? They prevented especially government sponsoring research being done on climate change. And they waged an active disinformation campaign. So nowadays, there's lots of people on this planet who think that climate change is a hoax, or that it's a fraud set up by scientists and liberals or whatever. There's lots of people who think that this is not a real problem and it doesn't deserve the kinds of serious consideration that it deserves. And the people who believe that, the people who believe that climate change is a hoax, have been bought and paid for by the energy industry. They have been taken for fools by a billion-dollar propaganda machine. The energy industry knew about climate change, and it not only did it not help the problem, but it actively tried to prevent anyone from helping the problem because there was a lot of money involved. We've seen this before. This is exactly what the tobacco companies did. Right? Tobacco companies knew long before the general public knew. The tobacco companies knew that cigarettes were dangerous, that they caused cancer, that there were serious health effects from smoking cigarettes. And instead of trying to improve cigarettes so they weren't as damaging. The tobacco industry tried to hide this research and then tried to lie about it. No, cigarettes aren't dangerous. And they lied about it for years, for decades, instead of actually dealing with the problem.
It's so funny how they dealt with it. It just how they could lie, and the excuses and the crap they could come up with and prevail of how long they did.
It's a delay tactic, right? So
yeah.
If I took climate change seriously, then I would have to change significant parts of what I do, and that's uncomfortable, and I don't want to do that. So I would rather fight against climate change, fight against the idea of climate change, so I don't have to deal with my problems. It's avoidance. It's incredibly immature, and this is an immaturity that's not just individuals' problem. It's our entire species is just not willing to face up to. It's worse. It's worse that we're not facing up to it. It's that we don't even know how to. We don't have the resources for dealing. We've never had to deal with a problem like this in the history of our species, a global problem. For the vast majority of our time on this planet, we've been dealing with very local problems, little small groups of people, maybe the size of a city. We've never had to deal with global problems. So we don't have any tools, we don't have the culture, we don't have any of the background necessary for dealing with this problem. Now maybe we should be optimistic about humans. Humans are very clever. Maybe they'll come up with something. They've come up with things before, and clearly humans have dealt with serious climate change before, radical changes in temperature. But the difference now is that it's the time. It's that this is all happening really, really fast. In the past, when we face these challenges, it's challenges that we have to deal with ourselves, or we have to come to terms with ourselves, and we have some resources for that. So, like the best examples that I know of is the Cold War. So during the Cold War, people had nuclear bombs, and if we let off all those nuclear bombs, then the world would end. Right? We could easily have killed off the entire human population if we just let off all our nukes. And we didn't do that. And it's kind of a miracle that we got through without launching the nukes. But when you think about it, it's not that much of a miracle, because what was required was diplomacy, right? Working with each other. It's hard to work with each other. It's very easy to get into fights, but when human population is on the line, then maybe we can learn to work with each other. In order to not have a nuclear war start, we just needed to work with each other enough that no one wanted to press the button. And we were successful at that. Working with each other is something we know how to do. Climate change isn't like that. It doesn't really matter if we work with each other, because climate change is happening so fast that we need something even more dramatic than that. Right? So if the only challenge was coming to agreement with someone who disagrees with us, that's not a big challenge. The challenge is reversing the change in the actual climate. Right? It is reversing the dynamics of this massive geosystem, and that's something we don't know how to do. We've never had to do it before. So it's a big and scary challenge. So let me talk a little bit. I'm almost out of time, but let me talk a little bit about geoengineering. No. Yeah. So this is my buddy John Lawhead. I've worked with him on a couple of projects before. He just finished a postdoc at USC, where he was working on geoengineering, in particular the ethics of geoengineering. So this is his talk, and I'm just going to run through some of this. So I want to get to the good stuff. We've talked about a little bit about this before. Mitigation is about stopping climate change before it starts, intervening on human behavior, things like the carbon tax, cap and trade. Looking for alternative energies. A lot of the discussion about climate change has been looking at alternative energy sources to get us off of oil, so we're not producing, get us off fossil fuels, so we're not producing all this greenhouse gases, and onto things like solar. Solar energy doesn't produce any emissions in the ideal case, and solar has gotten really cheap over the last decade or so, incredibly cheap, where it becomes a viable option at large scales. So a lot of the work that has been done has been put into these kinds of strategies. And this is the gold standard for climate change response. This is how most people think about climate change response. The problem is it doesn't work very well. Adaptation is about reducing the negative impact things like immigrating from coastal cities and so on, building levees. Manhattan will go underwater when the sea levels rise. Manhattan, it's an island and it's surrounded by water, and when the sea levels rise, Manhattan, especially the lower tip of Manhattan, will go underwater. The thing is that the lower tip of Manhattan is where the financial district is, and there's like billions of dollars, hundreds of billions of dollars in the world economy wrapped up in a few blocks in the southern tip of Manhattan. And because of that, people are going to be willing to build, right? So you might think the best thing to do for all the people in Manhattan, maybe they shouldn't be living on an island when climate change comes around. Maybe we should move them all off the island. But the thing is, there's so much money and so much power in the financial district and in other systems on Manhattan that we're probably going to work really hard to save it, even if it would be cheaper and make more sense to just let it sink. But what we're probably going to do is build billions of dollars worth of levees, elaborate technologies to try to keep it dry. How we're going to afford to pay for all that has yet to be seen. But these are the kind of things that people who talk about adaptation want to talk about, right? The idea is that you can't stop the sea levels from rising, but maybe we can build something so that it doesn't hurt us. Right? You can't stop sea levels from rising, but maybe we can move away from the coastal cities. We can change the way that we use agricultural lands, these kinds of things. Okay, so geoengineering is an alternative to both of these responses. It's trying to engineer changes to the global climate by operating on geosystems instead of human institutions. So what do I mean by operating on climate systems? Well, what I really mean, the issue is the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and related to that is what's called ocean acidification, which is carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide and so on, these gases in the ocean, in the surface ocean. So it causes temperature changes if you put greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, because it blocks the sunlight on the surface. But carbon dioxide also dissolves into the water, and the more carbon dioxide you get into the water, the more acidic it becomes. This is called ocean acidification. So the more acid, the more acidic the water. This also changes the kind of life that can live in the water. And a lot of that marine life is vital to the overall ecosystem. In particular, most of the oxygen that we breathe comes from biological creatures in this ocean surface. A lot of it comes from things like rainforests, but the vast majority of the oxygen in the atmosphere comes from marine biota, photosynthesizing and releasing oxygen over the oceans. So this image, what you're looking at, is it's the carbon cycle. This is the entire carbon cycle, as measured in gigatons of carbon per year. So what you're seeing here is that the surface ocean releases about 70.6 gigatons of carbon into the atmosphere every year, and it absorbs about 70 gigatons of carbon every year. So it releases 70.6 gigatons and it absorbs 70 gigatons. So it's almost unbalanced, slightly weighted towards more carbon in the atmosphere. The black numbers are the natural values, values without interference. And then the red numbers are the numbers when you consider human activity in addition to the natural process. So independent of human activity, the surface ocean releases 70.6 gigatons of carbon and absorbs 70 gigatons of carbon every year. But with the addition of human activity, the surface ocean absorbs an additional 22.2 gigatons of carbon, and it releases an additional 20 gigatons of carbon per year. Now notice what happens here. The natural system on its own is slightly weighted towards more carbon in the atmosphere. You're putting a little more carbon in the atmosphere than you're taking away. Right? So on balance, it's slightly weighted towards carbon in the atmosphere. But with the human addition, where it's sucking in 22.2 gigatons of carbon into the ocean and only spewing out an additional 20, this weights it in the opposite direction, where there's slightly more carbon in the ocean. Right? So we've gone from a balance that was putting slightly more carbon in the atmosphere to a balance that's putting substantially more carbon in the ocean. Right? And this is the kind of change that really matters when we're thinking about this carbon cycle. Not just the raw quantity of carbon, but how human additions to this process change it and maybe even switch it from from going one way to going another way. So the result of human activity means surface oceans are becoming more acidic, whereas the natural process itself was sort of taking acidity out of the ocean. So this reverse is a big deal. And you can see that quite a lot of our carbon is locked up in the surface ocean. So 900 plus 18 gigatons of carbon is locked up in the surface ocean. Notice that 3,700 gigatons of carbon are locked up in fossil fuels. 2,300 gigatons of carbon are locked up in the vegetation on the planet. And 35,000 gigatons of carbon are locked up in the deep ocean. By far, the most carbon on the planet is locked up in the deep ocean, but very little of that stuff actually makes it out to the rest of the carbon cycle. What matters most is the surface ocean, all this fossil fuel stuff that we're bringing up and burning. And then, yeah, so the surface vegetation, the surface ocean, and then all the fossil fuels. Right? This is where the carbon cycle happens. And so if we want to change the climate, if we want to change the rate of global warming, this is the system that we need to be operating on. In other words, a geoengineering process is going to take some aspect of this system and try to tweak it to get it back in the line that we want. Something to de-acidify the ocean, something to pull carbon out of the atmosphere, something to lock carbon, more carbon up in the land, something like that.
The ultimate goal is to take the carbon out of the atmosphere, correct?
So you need carbon in the atmosphere because that's what the plants breathe, right? So you need some carbon in the atmosphere, but the idea is to make it balanced again. Right? The idea is that our activity has set it off balance. And so what we want to do is not take all the carbon out of the atmosphere, but just offset the additions that we've put there.
Okay. So at this time right now, we have too much carbon in the atmosphere. And it's not that we need to take all, we don't obviously, like you just said before, not take it all out, but just enough so that we can operate at a, like, what's the ultimate goal? Like, operate at a certain temperature or? Yeah,
for the longest time, scientists have been using the 2 degrees centigrade benchmark as the threshold, the sort of point of no return.
Okay.
And they've been saying that it's absolutely vital that we keep below 2 degrees Celsius climate change.
Okay.
So don't take out all the carbon dioxide, don't change warming entirely, but just try to mitigate it so that it stays within the range that we want. If it's below 2 degrees centigrade, then we're not going to have as much problems with crop failures and so on. But if it goes beyond 2 degrees centigrade, then that's the point of no return. And remember, once you get beyond that point, then you get sort of the feedback starts cascading. So it starts multiplying the effects. So the warmer the temperature is, the less sea ice on the surface. The less sea ice on the surface, the lower the albedo, and that means the warmer it gets. So it sort of reinforces the process. Yeah, so I was just going to throw this thing up here again. So there's these periods where it's very red at the top.
Yeah.
There's lots of carbon dioxide. And then there's other periods where there's not very much carbon dioxide at all.
Okay.
So one way of thinking about this is if we can get the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere to be like this all year round, then maybe that would be good. That would be a good thing, so that we don't have these periods where it's super warm. If we can keep it this cool the entire time, that would be ideal.
So, but this is at 2 degrees Celsius. If we go below that, what if we go down to 1 degree or half a degree Celsius then? Yeah, so remember, half a degree Celsius is half a degree Celsius change from the average. So the average is the average temperatures from 1980, the average of all the temperatures. What is the average temperature? And then the 1 to 2 degrees Celsius change is a change from that average. So we're now 0.83 degrees warmer than you would expect on average. And the idea is that these geoengineering techniques are ways of trying to reduce this average so that we stay within that sort of sweet Goldilocks position. Okay. So this is the carbon cycle. This is the cycle that they want to change. I'm not going to go too deep into this. You can watch John's whole lecture. But the one example of geoengineering I want to talk about first is aerosol injections. This is the most popular idea, and it's gotten some big press over the last few years.
partly because it's the most technologically feasible in the near term. So here's what's going on. So we know that greenhouse gases in the environment can block the sun's rays on the surface. But the idea is that if we push these greenhouse gases high enough in the atmosphere, then maybe it'll prevent the sunlight from ever getting to the surface in the first place. So the idea is that the idea is to inject what are called aerosols. An aerosol just means how big the beads are. And aerosols are very, very small beads. And the idea is that you inject these aerosols at very high altitudes, usually using blimps. You take a blimp, go very high, and then release a bunch of aerosols. Usually the aerosols are sulfur dioxide. Sulfur dioxide is a greenhouse gas. It'll block the sunlight. And so the idea is you inject a bunch of this sulfur dioxide in order to block out the sunlight and lower temperatures. Usually sulfur dioxide or hydrogen sulfide, some sulfur compound. This is talked about because it's technologically feasible. So Facebook, a bunch of tech companies have been dealing with blimps, with high altitude blimps. They've been doing it for things like Wi-Fi, distributing Wi-Fi in remote locations and so on. But we've been developing our blimp technology, so we have the blimps to do this. We also have studied it quite extensively, where we run computer simulations. So here's a computer simulation. So A is what the temperature looks like now. And then the idea is you would inject these aerosols at the equators, because that's where it's hottest. So you inject these aerosols, and the rest of these images show you changes in temperature. So A is where we are right now, is no change in temperature. But if we were to do an aerosol injection, this is what we would expect. So notice that we're looking at relatively little change around the equatorial regions where we do the aerosol injection. It's still a little bit warmer in the northern hemisphere, a little warmer in the southern hemisphere, but not as warm as it would have been had we not done the injection. Right? So you do actually, when you run the models, when you run the simulations, it seems like injecting aerosols would actually have an effect on lowering the temperature. Now, there's problems with this. One problem is that you need a lot of material. They're talking about 5 to 7 teragrams of sulfur every year. This is tons and tons and tons of sulfur dioxide that you're injecting every year. Moreover, they worry that aerosol injections like this are addictive. So you release a bunch of sulfur dioxide in the atmosphere, but that sulfur will eventually fall out of the atmosphere after a couple of years, like 2 years or so. And that means that if you want to still have these effects, you need to go back and dump some more sulfur in the atmosphere. The idea is that this is supposed to be like a holdover strategy. Look, we need temperatures to get lower, and none of our policies are working. So maybe if we put these clouds in the sky, then we can keep the temperature lower. We're gonna have to renew it. We're gonna have to keep dumping sulfur in the atmosphere to keep these temperatures lower. But maybe this will hold us over until we get some other technology here, until we figure out how to change and address climate change in some other way. Right, so this is a sort of temporary measure. It might be addictive in the sense you have to keep doing it over and over again to keep finding the results. And it would be incredibly expensive. It's a huge amount of product that you're putting in the atmosphere. But we seem to have the technology ready, and it's been well studied. And more importantly, and this is the reason why it gets so much attention, is that we have natural models of basically the same thing. So certain kinds of volcanoes, when they erupt, also release sulfur dioxide, and they tend to do so in quantities comparable to what we would expect from an aerosol injection. So back in 1991, Mount Pinatubo erupted. It's a huge eruption, and it released about the same amount of sulfur dioxide in the atmosphere that we would do in a kind of aerosol injection. So it gives us a natural model for testing what happened. So what happened after Pinatubo? In fact, after Pinatubo, you did see about 0.5 degrees Celsius temperature drop. So you did see a change in global temperature. But not just global temperature, you saw lots of other kinds of changes. So for instance, you saw a change in precipitation. There was less rain. You caused droughts. And it was a very significant change in precipitation immediately following the Pinatubo explosion. So you can very clearly see the effect of this kind of aerosol injection on precipitation, on freshwater discharge, on the water supply. So this will have a big impact on the water. And importantly, it won't have an even impact on the water, but it'll have a variable impact on the water depending on where you live. So this is a measure of the drought severity over 1991 and 1992, in other words, immediately after the Pinatubo explosion. So what this graph tells you is who was experiencing droughts consequent after Pinatubo. And like I said earlier, what you see is that the most severely affected by the droughts are the people in the equatorial regions, right near the equator. Even though they're not the ones who are actually causing the problems, right? So this is the challenge, is doing a kind of aerosol injection like this. If anyone does it, it's probably going to be the United States or Western Europe. Maybe China does something like this. But these countries are all not the countries that are going to be experiencing the side effects. They'll feel the temperature drop, but they won't feel the side effects like the droughts, the impact on crops, the acid rain from the sulfur raining down on you. Right? All this stuff is being ignored. If the only interest we have is in keeping the temperature down, it seems like sulfur injection works. But there's all these other interests, like droughts, and in particular, like the way that it affects different populations differently. It's going to affect equatorial populations. These kinds of activities are going to affect equatorial populations, but those populations usually aren't the cause of the problem. They're not the ones who have any say in what they do about the problem, right? So they're just basically screwed over by the whole process. Again, this is the challenge. It's not a technical challenge. It's really not an engineering challenge. It's a political challenge. How do we build the tools for managing decisions like this? For deciding whether it's appropriate, what compensation do we give to the people in the equatorial regions for having to deal with all this damage? How do we, as a globe, as an entire global population, how do we make these decisions? We don't know how to do it. This is a challenge for your generation. This is your generation's big challenge, is to come up with global politics that can allow us to deal with these situations, because we don't have them yet. The really scary thing about things like this is that they can be, releasing sulfur on the scale of Pinatubo, you get ozone damage, you get droughts, you get, potentially you get an increased greenhouse effect, so it might have the exact opposite effect that we want. It doesn't have any impact on ocean acidification, right? This is only for working on the temperature, it's not for generally fixing the climate problems. It's only slightly less ridiculous than a Bond-Villain plot. But the really scary thing about this is that it's expensive to do this, but it's the kind of expense that maybe a dedicated actor can do on their own. Like, imagine China decides, we really need the temperature to go down by 2 degrees centigrade. So we're going to do this without any input from the international community, without any agreements, sort of international agreements, right? They just do it on their own. Or even worse than a state actor, what if a business or private actor, right? What if Google decides we need 2 degrees to get cut off our temperature, so I'm going to go and inject a bunch of sulfur in the atmosphere? Right? These are the kind of things that can be done by non-state actors, by individuals, but they can have massive impact on the global environment. And again, we have no ways of deciding the correct or fair way of doing this stuff. In this in this Prezi, there's a couple of other discussions of different kinds of geoengineering changes to albedo. I think France has a policy where they require all rooftops be painted white to slightly increase the albedo on the surface. It's not going to have much of an effect, but it's going to have some effect, right? These kinds of things, these large-scale geoengineering projects. The really big one is sequestration. There's all sorts of techniques and new technologies for actually pulling carbon directly out of the atmosphere. So instead of adding more clouds to the atmosphere, these are techniques for pulling clouds out of the atmosphere, or pulling carbon out of the atmosphere. And these kinds of techniques are new and they're sort of exciting. They look a lot more promising than aerosol injections. Aerosol injections look really scary. I think aerosol injections are mostly scary because it seems like something someone would actually do. It could have a big impact. So think about these things. Think about the problem of climate change. Think about how to deal with climate change. think about the ways that we're dealing with them and how they fail. What can we do? Also think about geoengineering. I have a lot of resources here for thinking about the ethical challenges of geoengineering or climate engineering, how to deal with that, whether it's ever okay to engineer climate systems in this way. Yeah, so I hope that gets you going. Do you have any questions, Glenn?
Now, it just reminds me of that, the aerosol kind of reminds me of, I know BP is not the same thing, but it's like if Google takes the same, we're going to do this, we're going to reduce this, and this is what we're going to do. Just like how BP is like, oh, we're going to drill it this way. I know we're not going to pass safety, I guess we're not going to pass safety inspections and stuff, but we're going to make so much money off it. If Google or if a company had that mindset and then something happens, just like it's a BP all over again, then we got to clean up after them and stuff. So does anyone really want to take that risk? I mean, there's something in the future to think about. So
yeah. My sense of it is that for the longest time, corporations were resisting even talking about climate change or facing up to it. And within the last few years, that has sort of changed where they're willing to talk about climate change. We're just not taking as strong steps as we need to adequately address it. And my sense is that we've switched from denying that climate change is a problem to recognizing it's a problem and realizing that there's nothing we can do about it. So my sense is in the next few years, we're going to see our companies trying to get as much as they can while they're getting still good. And try to get theirs while there's still something to get. So there are people scrambling for the scraps.
Another thing is, with these companies, obviously, I think it's all about the power they have. So with that, it's all about the money they can make. Mm-hmm. So from that, I think climate change, I think the reason they're getting more into it, obviously, just like the one thing, kind of like gas prices and stuff like that, rising and stuff, is like, we need to stop this and stuff. So how are we gonna make more money and still have the people on our side and stuff? So it's like, maybe now we should go to climate change. Now we can see maybe we could research something, open that up again, and pull something out so that we can make money and keep our power. Just for the big company. So
good. Good suggestions. Yeah, okay, I think I'm done saying everything I want to say, so I'm going to go ahead and stop the meeting here.
Okay, what is the secret word?
Oh, that's a good question. Aerosol.
Aerosol, okay.
Aerosol.
Cool.
All right.
Another thing I did last week, I didn't get to do it, because I didn't see that. I saw today that you did put it up, but when we signed off, I didn't see any secret word or mention anything.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I mean, remember, this is just extra credit, so
okay.
I probably won't give it to you, but it's fine. Just make sure you do it this week.
Okay.
Yeah. All right.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Glenn. Thank you for listening to me for the last hour. All right, see you.